Most of the global pipeline of coal-fired power plants under construction are in our region. And at the same time, 60% of global coal reserves come from the region. And some countries then, of course, have a high dependency on income from coal exports, meaning that there is also strong political support in some governments in the region to continue with coal. On the other side, I mean, what our environment is telling us is clear. We all need to find ways to reduce global warming. We need the commitment of countries to phase out of coal and to move towards energy transition pathways. And one way to achieve this is to put a price on carbon and to apply carbon pricing instruments, as well as to remove fossil fuel subsidies. A price on carbon is particularly attractive because it increases the cost of carbon-intensive activities. It can also generate revenue, and it can therefore create the fiscal space required to support a shift towards the inclusive green low-carbon recovery that we need in the aftermath of COVID. So against this backdrop, our session will explore the potential role of carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform to contribute to a green recovery in Asia-Pacific countries, and to explore how to address typical implementation challenges. And I have three excellent speakers to help explore this question by focusing the conversation around how domestic revenue mobilization through carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform supports efforts to green the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, to address how political challenges and barriers to the implementation can be overcome, and also how revenue use and its effective communication can contribute to the sustainability and success of carbon pricing and subsidy reform in the region. So without much further ado, let's start. I have three speakers, as I said. I hope the third speaker, Ms. Ayman Yesekina, has also joined us by now. But our other two speakers are Jens Radzinski and Ms. Anita Nikolova. I would like to ask Jens to speak first. Jens Radzinski is the lead of the Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and the Pacific, and will speak on regional dialogues on carbon pricing in Asia and the Pacific. Jens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katinka. And yeah, I was trying to get my video started. That's working. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues, participants, and co-panelists. And yeah, while the slides are being started, I can also just start to introduce myself and the RCC Bangkok a little bit. First of all, thank you very much for the organizers of the event for allowing me to speak in this panel. My name is Jens Radzinski, and I'm the regional lead of the UNFCCC IGS Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and the Pacific. We're located in Bangkok, and it's really my honor to present for the RCC Bangkok in this panel. First of all, yeah, you probably all know the UNFCCC. Our headquarters is in Bonn, and that's where most of my colleagues are based. But the UNFCCC Secretariat has also started to establish the Regional Collaboration Center. It's a network of 6 centers in different parts of the world, and the RCC Bangkok, hosted by IGS in Bangkok here, is one of them. So I think we can start with the first slide. The initial focus of the RCCs, the regional center, was the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. So we already have a strong background actually on carbon pricing. But during last year, and especially also since the entry into force of the Paris Agreement, the role of the RCCs has shifted away a little bit from a purely CDM focus. I think now slides are not moving. Okay, I think I can continue. Has shifted from a purely CDM focus also to facilitating the support to countries to implement the Paris Agreement, to implement their NDCs, to pursue the goals of the Paris Agreement, especially, of course, the temperature goals to keep temperature below 2 degrees and aiming for temperature increase below 1.5 degrees since pre-industrial level. And we have seen with pledges and commitments as of countries of the NDCs that were submitted by the end of last year, and the UNFCCC Secretariat prepared the NDC synthesis report that these commitments in the NDCs would purely represent a reduction of emissions of 0.5% by 2030, while science is actually telling us that we need to cut emission in half by 2030. So it's very clear. Countries are not yet doing enough to comply with these goals of the Paris Agreement. And but ahead of COP26, we also hope to see more submissions of updated NDCs, increased commitments, and long-term strategies and targets. So with this background, we also see the urgent need to reduce fossil fuel emissions at scale. And we are supporting countries also with our efforts on work on carbon pricing, especially also climate finance and non-party stakeholder engagements are very important areas of our work. And one of the key initiatives I would also like to introduce briefly in the introduction, I know we'll have also time for more detailed questions, but this initiative is the Siaka Initiative, the Collaborative Instruments for Ambitious Climate Action. Can I see the next slide, please? The Siaka Initiative was announced in COP 2020, sorry, 22, sorry, COP 2020, yeah, 22. And yeah, it's an initiative that assists countries in the development of carbon pricing instruments for implementing their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And we've been supporting and working under this initiative for a couple of years already, especially in the Southeast Asian region and also with Pakistan as a single country. It's a global initiative from all RCCs. And yeah, mostly working with single countries, but here especially we've been working also with ASEAN as a region. Last year, because of the lack of physical meetings due to COVID, we started organizing the regional dialogues on carbon pricing, the so-called REDICAPs. These were virtual events across the globe, and we conducted our REDICAPs here with the ASEAN group of countries and also in Central Asia, other RCCs had similar initiatives in other parts of the world. And during these regional dialogue, so parties with different knowledge and experience on carbon pricing had the opportunity to share learnings, safely discuss challenges and barriers, and identify opportunities to collaborate across borders on carbon pricing instruments. And both dialogues in ASEAN and Central Asia, we organized in collaboration also with other UN agencies, especially ESCAP, UNEP, and UNDP, under the work program of the so-called issue-based coalitions of UN agencies on climate change mitigation and air pollution, and also in collaboration with the regional partner. There was a consensus among participants of these countries that really more frequent and regular dedicated opportunities to update neighboring countries on the progress and challenges in promoting and adoption of carbon pricing instruments can really assist in identifying successful strategies and also to help replicate efficient approaches where possible. So following these dialogues and our experience with working with the Asia-Pacific region on carbon pricing for quite some time already, I'd just like to give a couple of, or show a couple of learnings and recommendations which we have for advancing carbon pricing in this region. So next slide, please. First of all, yeah, we can, I mean, I think it's also already been mentioned in the introduction and the background information to this event. There's certainly a growing interest on carbon pricing, or interest in carbon pricing in the region, both from countries and also a large number of partners and so development partners and support agencies. So I think that's very clear over the past 5 years that we've been working, especially here also in ASEAN. We can clearly identify that there's been a shift and growing interest. Yeah, there's also certainly the need for increased regional coordination and really see what kind of opportunities can arise from these regional exchanges and learning. So because I mean, more countries are engaged, and we really also focus on working with groups of countries to also harmonize, if possible, approaches across regions. Such kind of coordination done by us, but also other partners under the IBC is very welcome and very needed. And yeah, so it was also clear from both regions that we are working with in ASEAN and Central Asia that there are really significant opportunities in countries to collaborate and not just in sharing experience and learnings, but also in the long run, really exploring opportunities in linking emission trading systems or other carbon pricing instruments, especially also for smaller countries. This gives the opportunity of a greater coverage of facilities and instruments. Also increases market liquidity and also the opportunity to build on existing MRV structures to harmonize it and then build a larger pool. Also reduces the risk of carbon leakage across borders if these coordination and collaboration is working across all regions. And yeah, of course, there's also leverage, strength and opportunities of every country and each and every country, and find opportunities where mitigation measures are really most economically efficient. Also from RCCs from other regions, not here yet, but we're working on it and we're discussing and pursuing it with the help of our partners. For example, in the RCCs that are covering East Africa, West Africa, but also Latin America, Caribbean, we see forming of carbon market alliances, so groups of countries supported by developing partners that really try to facilitate the collaboration and drive the progress. There's certainly also what we learned from our dialogues here, some interest to establish maybe some similar structures. Good. Yeah, we've done also other work under Siaka, again, studies for market preparation or preparedness of countries and alignment and harmonization of MRV systems in both ASEAN and other regions. And yeah, we've also noticed that there was a strong appetite for learning from countries, for learning from each other and listening to progress that has been made in countries, neighboring countries. I'd say especially also in the ASEAN region, large diversity of progress on MRV, on carbon pricing. So certainly there's some interesting learning experienced among the countries. So what we clearly noticed in the dialogues was also the need to build further capacity. Also requests from countries have reached us to build capacity regarding design considerations of such carbon pricing instruments, and also how revenue from such instruments can be used. That's certainly a very important aspect to increase public acceptance, and also reducing impact on marginalized and poor groups, and ensuring long-term sustainability of such carbon pricing policies. So yeah, a key recommendation that we also learned was that these approaches really need to be anchored within the long-term planning of the countries, within the NDCs and the long-term emission development strategies to be really successful. Really, we are reaching a point, and we're also seeing this much more understanding how all these instruments and mechanisms have to be linked and really harmonized to be successful. Yeah, and also then we do see that the signals that we are rising now, especially if these carbon pricing instruments are incorporated into the long-term planning, into net zero commitments, into long-term emission development strategies, they can really be effective in setting the price signal for yeah, to certainty for private sector stakeholders, business, to really understand that's here to stay, that's coming, and to have a certainty that investments go in the right direction. So as of now, 4 countries in the region have committed to net zero, or have published and announced net zero commitments. 6 parties have submitted long-term the LT-LETs, and we are certainly also waiting for more of such submissions and commitments before Glasgow COP26, starting in less than 50 days. So yeah, we will continue to also support countries in the region on their introduction and considerations on carbon pricing instruments. And I think everything else I'd like to leave then for the question and answer session to go more into the specific details. And with this, I'd just like to give back to you, Katinka.
Thanks a lot, Jens. I think that really set the scene really nicely in providing us this broad regional overview. And as you said, I'm sure there will be opportunities later in the question to unravel what that really means at country level. Great. So from here, let's go to my very dear colleague, Ms. Anita Nikolova, who is an environmental affairs officer at ESCAP and leads our climate work. And she will share some insights related to building forward better carbon pricing and green recovery.
Thank you very much,
Anita.
Katinka. Yes, thank you very much, Katinka. While I'm looking for the presentation coming up, thank you for the colleagues to set it up. Yes, can we go to the second slide? Just setting up the scene. So we are experiencing the biggest existential crisis at the moment, and it's compounding waves or some other terminologies like the gray rhinos that are coming up together. These are the crises that we kind of like address separately, but they are actually interlinked and connected. So what are the challenges? Next slide, please, for the Asia Pacific region. First of all, since we're talking about here the building better forward, all right? First of all, there is very little understanding in the countries about the opportunities that greening the COVID responses and aligning them with the climate action and with the SDGs are going to actually help them to use the scarce budgets very targetedly. And we've done a study last year which showed that very little of the countries have done that. Maybe only New Zealand is standing out as the most having 6 policy measures which are aligned with the NDCs, but they're actually not in their NDCs as well. So the second challenge is the next slide, is that basically the commitments of the countries so far in the NDCs, as Jens has mentioned, the mitigation commitments and also the adaptation commitments are not sufficient enough to bring us towards the 1.50 global emissions. We've done a scenario which shows that there's a lot more to go, and even if all the pledges that have been quite a number of them are rising with every day are reached, we still have a leftover emissions to reduce in 2060. So if we go to the next slide, the third challenge is actually that there's a lot of talk about COVID reducing emissions in 2020, but to be honest, the issue that it didn't happen in our region. So we are just close to the 2019 emissions that were a very big peak. So now how we can address that? Next slide, please. And just for the reminder to everyone that we need to look at the net zero carbon emissions by 2050 if we want to keep our world in 1.5 degrees, and then deal with the GHG emissions between 2060 and 2070, right? And so where is our region into that? Next slide, please. I mean, the next slide is showing you the top 10 emitters in our region and where they with their pledges and commitments and their contribution to the regional emissions, which are very significant. So if the top 10 really implement their commitments, take them very seriously, and even go to carbon neutral, we will have a big impact on the regional and the global temperature rises. Next slide shows you something which Jens mentioned as well. These are as I said, the race to decarbonization is very much on. That is because of the strong UK presidency campaign, and we see that there are quite a number of countries that have pledged net zero. However, we have different levels of that. New Zealand, Fiji, and Korea are for us the highest, after Bhutan, of course, that claimed that they have achieved net zero. But the other 3 countries already have legal documents or something in the process. The ones in red are actually with the policy document, and these are very significant emitters and a very important contribution. The rest are the green, basically those that have they're under consideration, and the rest is those that have no commitments so far. So there's a lot more to go. Next slide, please. So what is the way forward, right? We need to strengthen enabling factors and raise the climate ambition, and that is going to help us also to align the post-COVID response, which should be real recovery, to be more greener and with the SDG implementation. And at the same time, this could be supported by low carbon development strategies, as Jens mentioned in his previous presentation. If we go to the next slide, how this could be done is by strengthening the enabling factors, and we have identified in our recent study, which is interagency study with UNEP and UN Women and other partners from the IBC. We need to mainstream stronger mainstreaming of the climate action in laws and policies. We need stronger vertical and horizontal integration. That will help also is that funds really are channeled down to the local level for climate action. where the things have to happen. And then we also need to have better and stronger allocations of financial resources into sectors to support the NDC commitments. And the monitoring capacity needs to be strengthened. Transparency, accountability, that will also help the private sector to invest in the right way. So we go to the next slide, where I would like to show you about this. My cat is really participating in the event very actively. So the next slide shows you where the carbon pricing comes into play, all right? And that is, we need to strengthen the climate ambition, and we could do it with carbon pricing. This will strengthen the carbon neutrality pledges, as was mentioned by Jens, and some of the net zero pledges that are having policy documents do include this instrument. The national level decarbonization will be strengthened. Peaking of carbon emissions will come more strongly into the documentation, and the primary sector decarbonization. Now, going to the next slide, I would like to show you that the carbon pricing actually is not an environmental instrument. It is a pure economic instrument. It is basically a tax. It's a tax or a collecting a fee, which can go and can be channeled to various activities. The primary environmental activities is decarbonization of the electricity sector, shifting to EVs, and that needs to be supported also with fossil fuel subsidy reform. And then we go to investments in efficiency, also in reducing emissions in the agricultural sector, transport, and of course, investing in our natural carbon sinks, which are the most important for this region to cover the gap that we have with collecting the emissions that are generated and mitigation efforts not enough. So and we have been a very active partner with the activities on promoting carbon pricing in the region that Jens has mentioned earlier in his presentation. Next slide, please. And we have developed a tool, which is a modeling tool, which is a macroeconomic modeling tool based on our colleagues, Sveta is here, and Hamza talked about this macroeconomic modeling yesterday, that supported the socioeconomic survey of 2021, and it had touched on carbon pricing as a very useful economic instrument for reviving the economy in post-COVID and for investing in innovation and in economic activities, etc. So our model, which now is moving into simulation tool that can be tested by any policymaker that has no understanding of any macroeconomic or economic factors, can also play like a tool with it, rising the carbon price at certain level, what would be the impacts, right? So we see that there will be immediate impact on inflation, that is for sure. But that can be countered immediately with through the integrated, as I said, through these enabling factors, integrated horizontal cooperation between the ministries can be countered with different measures. This would be measures that will go into, we can go to the next slide, please. Which shows the case with Indonesia. So basically, we have a certain price, it is set up, and then it really is channeled to various activities. So if the price of productivity increases, those enterprises that have put immediately energy efficiency measures because they need to reduce their costs, because the energy becomes very expensive, they will get incentives, they will get certain funds, they will get support for innovation. This already is in action. For example, Thailand has been putting these measures ahead. Also looking into investments in innovation for electrification of the transport. This will create immediately new jobs. We've seen that happening in quite a number of countries that are using these measures. We also will see that the energy mix would change because shifts will go to renewable energy production. And so Jens mentioned something which is true, and that is coming from our research as well, that when this carbon pricing, and from another research of ESCAP, this is a joint report from UNCTAD and ESCAP on climate trade with climate-friendly goods, which also looks at the cross-border adjustment of carbon pricing. So then definitely when it is a regional carbon price, it will be beneficial. What does it mean? So we stop carbon leakage. So what does carbon leakage mean? It means that there's when a country has very stringent carbon pricing and climate policies, then production facilities go to another country where this is not that stringent. So, and then from there we have basically the carbon is produced there, and then it's not taxed, and it goes into the goods, and it's basically a complicated issue to deal with. But when it's a regional, there is no danger for that, and it is more effective and much faster. Opportunities are there to generate additional funding to deal with. So you're basically reducing the competitivity issue of productivity. You're channeling the funds for more low carbon development and facilities in the sub-region. Next slide, please, is showing you a little bit of impact of a carbon price of $20. What happens with that? And for each of this is a channeling of this impacts, and for each of this there's measures to counter that and to work with this. The next slide, it provides you the key takeaways, which are basically just a summary of what I've been saying. So the carbon pricing is a short-term impact on inflation, but it has a direct impact on emission reductions. And when it's channeled to in nature-based solutions, it has a multiplier effect of reducing carbon emissions, also capturing the carbon emissions at the local level, and also bringing local community livelihoods improvement, job generation, food security, and disaster risk reduction. So it is a very important channel. The multiplier effect is quite big. As I said, regional, sub-regional approach to applying carbon pricing is very beneficial, and is going to create opportunities for really stronger and more just to move to a new way of producing without that dependency on and that addiction to fossil fuels. The carbon tax revenue is very important. So if the collected revenue is 100% channeled back to the economy, especially now, it creates the necessary liquidity for these recovery processes, and would be conditional, of course, because it will make this recovery activities investments in lower carbon activities, right, which will create jobs and already are creating jobs and will create a different type of consumption. Also, the CPIs have can support other national priorities, for example, reducing inequality and poverty. So it could be decided that from this 100% of the revenue, 10% or 15% goes for investment in health measures, even vaccinations, buying vaccines, reducing local communities, like, for example, they have less access to clean fuels. They're using fossil fuels. So investment for them to have solar access, to have low emission stoves, etc., cooking stoves. As I said, investment in NPS and nature-based solutions as carbon sinks, investments in renewable energy efficiency, and combating air pollution. So basically, this means that a certain amount of that revenue can go to invest in machinery in the agricultural production, which is like a big stumbling block now, because instead of having machines, the families are burning the residue of crops, and that creates huge amount of pollution. Jens will confirm that he's suffering in Chiang Mai from it, and this is definitely one very good opportunity to create that revenue. And as I said, CPIs can have direct social impact, creating jobs, creating opportunities for innovation, feeding into innovation funds, improving health and raising productivity. And they would be supporting very much the climate action enabling activities. So the next slide shows you how to connect, how to express interest to be using the carbon policy simulation tool, which will be a web-based, very user-friendly tool to work with policymakers, especially decision makers. So the macroeconomists at the national level are providing the data and for different countries, for example, and based on that, the policymaker can play with the amount of the carbon pricing to see what will happen, what will be the impact on the macroeconomic and environmental and social factors. But you could also use it in the NDC units if they decide to reduce carbon emissions by 30%, what level of carbon pricing they would need to have. That is also possible. So this tool is coming soon, hopefully fully functional by mid-October. So you could register your interest, so we will know you and we'll have your contact details to be able to send you the link to join a simulation session. And that is from me. I hope I've managed to keep into the time.
Thanks, Anita, for these very clear messages. Firstly, that there is insufficient alignment of SDG-related, climate-related, and post-COVID recovery policies. NDC commitments in the region are not high enough. Carbon pricing instruments can be a way forward. And fourthly, we have a very useful tool coming up at ESCAP that can help countries to understand what exactly the impacts of carbon pricing are in relation to different macroeconomic indicators. And I look forward to an interesting discussion. I'm sure there are going to be many questions, especially around the tool that you just presented. With this, let's move to somebody who works at country level. Ms. Ayman Yesekina is the director of the GHG Inventory Department in the Republic of Kazakhstan, where she oversees the analysis and the development of legislations in the area of climate policy and emission trading systems. So she will talk to us about the emission trading system in Kazakhstan today. Over to you, Ms. Yesekina.
Hello. Could you share my
I can hear you, yes.
Hi, Ayman. Do you need us to play the presentation from outside, or are you going to share the screen yourself?
I do have my presentation.
Okay, we will play from outside.
I can share.
We can see your screen.
Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Ayman Yesekina. I am from joint stock company Жасыл-Даму. It is subordinated organization of Ministry of Ecology, Geology and Natural Resources of Republic of Kazakhstan. Our organization provides assist of realization of ETS in Kazakhstan. And now, brief history of ETS of RK. 2011 was implemented new chapter in Ecology Code of RK. It is a regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. 2013 launch of national ETS. It was 1 year pilot phase, implementation of the first national allocation plan for 2013-2014, implementation of the second national allocation plan for 2014-2015, and was first trading of quota units on the Caspian Commodity Exchange. 2015 development of the third NAP and then identification of errors, and in 2016 suspension of ETS until 1st January 2018. 2017 preparation for relaunch of ETS of RK. Emission trading system for period 2013-2015 regulates equivalent carbon dioxide emissions, covers emitters whose emissions exceed 20,000 tons of equivalent carbon dioxide per year. The distribution of greenhouse gas emissions quotas was based on historical quota method, and quotas were issued per company. And national quotas allocation plans for this period, sectors of economy was energy, coal, oil and gas extraction and industry. Number of enterprises was about 160. Principle of quota allocation, it was historical method, reduction obligation 0 and 1.5% in 2015. And quota volume was about 150 million tons of CO2. Gaps were inaccuracies of environmental code and resulting technical contradictions, possibility to obtain additional quotas, inaccuracy of calculations, and lack of verified companies. Emission ETS for period 2018-2020. ETS is based on benchmarking following international practices. Quotas were allowed per installation, not company. Regulates only carbon dioxide. The plant operators have chosen the quota method independently, the historical method and benchmarking method. And 52 specific benchmarks have been developed for the sectors energy, industrial, and oil and gas sectors. And benchmarking method was chosen by 149 installation. Historical method was chosen by 76 installations. Oops. I can share next slide. Okay. ETS 2021 full transition to the benchmark method based on enterprise production data for 2017-2019, new environmental code of Republic of Kazakhstan, and development of project regulations in the field on GHG emissions regulation under the new environmental code, and developing a roadmap for the implementation of the updated INDC for the next 5 years, development of 1 baseline and 3 alternative scenarios. And we expected, we planned next reforms in ETS. They are updating the methodologies for calculating greenhouse gas emissions with implementation of level 3. It is application of laboratory factors. Annual reduction rate will be at least 1.5% until 2030. Introduction of auctioning, improvement of electronic reporting, improvement of registry of carbon units, and linking with implementation markets. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for giving us these good insights into the emissions trading system of Kazakhstan. And again, I'm sure that there will be questions around how you instrumentalize that. I would now like to open the floor up to questions from participants. It would be great if all three panelists could perhaps turn on their videos. Jens, Anita, Ayman, can I ask you to turn on your videos? And again, as we are getting ready for this next part of the session today, I encourage all participants in the session to put their questions into the chat, and we will then share them with the panelists. And as you're getting ready to ask your questions, Jens, I was wondering, you had shared as one of the major learnings from your regional dialogues, the focus on revenue usage and stakeholder commitments. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, I think revenue usage and also stakeholder communication and stakeholder consultation were some of the aspects that I mentioned really important for the acceptance of such carbon pricing instruments. There is, yeah, I mean, carbon pricing instruments always sounds like, and of course it is an additional cost factor, but I think there's always the conception that it kind of adds additional cost on the economy, on private sector production costs, and kind of like an additional tax, and that of course really doesn't help to win acceptance for such instruments. I think there are plenty of different ways to overcome such misconception. Certainly, communication, stakeholder communication, very important aspects. I think from the examples that we have in the region that have introduced carbon pricing, we've heard a lot that the process is very lengthy. It's not easy. It's not something you can introduce in months or a year or so, because it really needs the consultation to win the acceptance, to really also listen. I get a signal here, bad network quality. I hope you can hear me well. Let me know if that's not the case. Is okay? Okay. So there are examples really of year-long stakeholder consultations, really to listen to, especially private sector, then who maybe in the beginning think they would need to carry the cost. But if you include them really at the very early stage, understand the concerns and also communicate how these concerns can, in the design of the instruments, be reflected. There is, of course, the instrument or the aspects of revenue, recycling of revenues, meaning using revenues of such carbon pricing instruments, then again to pay back to the industry in other forms, or make sure the revenues are used for green investments again. So actually creating this kind of cycle. Also the protection maybe, I think we haven't mentioned it a lot. We've talked a lot about carbon pricing, but I think the other side of it, and I think it was mentioned in the introduction and the session, also the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, there's always the aspects of like, aren't we hurting the most vulnerable, and how do we protect them? And I think there are clear measures of how to remove such subsidies, and maybe for small households and small users, there could be other rules than for big industries. So I think that's again, the revenues that you get from carbon pricing, or the subsidies that you remove, certainly is a potential to reinvest this, to use these additional funds to reinvest, to really bring us closer and transition the economy. Because essentially, if you don't do this, there's always the risk of investing into the wrong technologies that in a couple of years won't be usable anymore, so-called stranded assets. So if you continue to invest into such polluting technologies, you'd have the problem again in 10 years or something when you finally have to scrap them. I think that's probably enough from my side, and give my colleagues here the chance to come in.
Thanks. And actually, it links to a question that I see in the chat targeting Ayman. Jacqueline, do you want to go ahead and raise your question?
Question about two questions, yeah. About impact.
Yeah, I
of
wondered
ETS
whether
in
Jacqueline.
Kazakhstan.
Sorry, I wondered whether Jacqueline wanted to raise a question. If not, I will read it out. So there are two questions to you, Ayman. Oh, I see he's getting online now. Go ahead.
Yes, apologies. I had to put on my camera. Yeah, so I had two questions for Ayman, actually. The first of all, it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the impacts of the trading scheme on greenhouse gas emissions trends since it was introduced. So that's the first question. And secondly, has the ETS raised revenue? And what are the envisaged plans for the revenue? How will the revenues be used in future if revenues haven't been raised yet? So what's the outlook as well for revenue used from the trading scheme? Thank you.
Thank you. Now in Kazakhstan, there are trade between operators of company, and we plan to implement paid auctioning in frame of strategy of low carbon development in Kazakhstan after its approval. And we plan to have a separate bill that plan to have the revenues from paid auctioning in frame of national allocations in the next from the next allocation plans after maybe 2023, I think. And
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Did you want to say something else? Ayman, did you want to say something else in response to this question? If not, let's follow up with a question by Aquila Ali.
What about carbon pricing instruments on consumers? How do you reduce?
Aquila,
So
do you want to come in and?
We have instrument of offset projects, and our quotas are allocated free in the frame of national allocation plan. It is not today's situation in Kazakhstan.
Can I ask a question? What is the current
Anita,
price of carbon? What is the carbon price that you now? And the ETS is actually between like emitters and those that have reduced, right? It's a trading. She's gone. She's gone. Yeah,
Sorry.
you're back. Okay. So my question is, what is the current level of the price? Because a couple of years ago, it was only $1, right? 465 TNK or something like that. And second question is, there is no actual revenue collection, right? You're not putting the funds in one pot. It's just like emitters are buying from those that have reduced emissions permit, basically, right? On this price.
Yeah, right. And now price of carbon, it's about $1 also.
If I can add a little bit here, because we're talking about two different things. Now, those people that are interested in the revenue, they are looking into more carbon tax. It means that those that are actually having emissions above certain level, so there should be an assignment of the emissions for each enterprise, which is going to a very strong monitoring and review of the GHG emissions of every enterprise, right? Based on the reporting requirements of the Paris Agreement, which we trained you for that, right? So basically, then you know that if you're using that much more energy and it means you're producing that much more carbon, you have to pay that. And this is collected in a pot, and that pot, when it's a tax, it goes to the tax revenue authority. Then it can be distributed for various policies that the government decides to do. This has been done in Singapore, and I think it's they have actually a banking facility that is doing investments in renewable energy or in other low carbon opportunities in the country. They have built this experience on a previous, like 6-7 years ago, water tax. Because Singapore has a water shortage issue, so that was very lengthy process of development, and they have developed it exactly with that purpose, to collect the revenue and to support low-income families, and to provide more access to water, because they import it from Malaysia or from other countries.
Now we develop the roadmap for implementation of INDC, and we develop 44 methods to realization our INDCs, and we plan to develop our alternative resources. And transit to natural gas, and so on.
Kazakhstan pledged to have carbon neutral, right? By 2060?
Yeah, 2060, yeah.
So what kind of policy document do you have developed to support that?
To support the roadmap for realization of our INDC, and conception of low development of Republic of Kazakhstan. These two documents will be in the COP of 26.
Thank you. I see there is another question in the chat. We'll get back to that in a little while, but I also wanted to return to some of the questions that the organizers of the session had set out as leading questions. And I guess I would like to hear from all three of you your views on how political challenges and barriers to the implementation of carbon pricing and also fossil fuel subsidy could be overcome. You had already Jens, pointed out some of the limitations, especially in respect to fossil fuel subsidy. But from your perspective, both from the regional level and the experiences you've gained there, as well as from country level, in that context, we can perhaps hear from Ayman. What are some of the major political challenges, and how could they be overcome? How could they be overcome? Who would like to go first?
For carbon neutrals or in main I don't know methods.
Both for the implementation of carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform. The challenges and the barriers.
The challenges will after our roadmap approvement.
I am sorry, I did not fully hear that.
Sorry. The challenges about fossil fuels and another methods will after our approvals of these two documents. They are the roadmap of realization our INDC and concept of low carbon development of Republic of Kazakhstan.
Yes, thank you. Let's hear also from Jens and from Anita. Jens, you're muted.
Sorry, that always happens if I raise the hand, then you click away the hand and then you forget the microphone. Yeah, I think, of course, I mean, we've been talking about introducing price on pollution, on carbon, different kind of tax for decades. I would say, and obviously there's always a big resistance and increasing prices and increasing consumer prices and hurting the economy and all this. I think we now, and from my also impressions that I have, especially from the last 2 years, I'd say from last year on, and I mean, in my introduction, I explained that the global commitments under the submitted NDCs are still much too little. Obviously, we need much more ambition and we need much more climate action. But despite this, I think you can feel that now that we are starting to operate under the Paris Agreement and countries really start to understand how these NDCs work, how the cycle of NDCs work. And I think there's also much more discussion, and you see this on the net zero commitments, and now very slowly, actually, we start looking into these long-term strategies. I think all of this is really starting to work, maybe not in numbers yet, but in the activity, in the discussions, and in the understanding of countries that there's no way back. I mean, we've implemented this system, and I think from here we can only move forward. We also see this in discussions with the private sector. We have very recently also in Thailand engaged with the private sector. We have initiatives Race to Zero for the private sector to also come up with commitments. So private sector, of course, always was quite resistant to such changes, but also really start to understand, wait a minute, we have these agreements, my country has submitted the commitments, and really kind of the pressure or the urgency, also, of course, from IPCC reports and the discussion about how this really translates the temperature rise, how this translates into emission trajectories and the urgent need to come down with emissions by 2030 by 45 to 50%. So I think all this really slowly starts to make an impact in how people think and perceive this, and the understanding that you cannot duck away like I would be doing now. You cannot escape. You have to engage. You have to deal with it, and you have to be part of it. There's a global pressure, of course, also in all the supply chains that companies in all parts of the world contribute now and become kind of carbon neutral very soon. So I think this should actually help also politicians and governments to make a point that policies and now also regulations are coming, will come, and since they have agreed, committed under the NDCs and in general in Paris Agreement, I think this all really gives a strong support for governments in the coming years, and I think the global pressure will only increase on the political level, on the negotiation level, but also in the real economy where companies understand. So I think that's one one aspect I wanted to mention here. And then back to
Thanks,
you.
Jens. Here's some cautious optimism. Anita, would you agree?
Well, I do also believe that the private sector is going to make the difference. That's where it's happening. And that's where, as Jens mentioned, this is true. Many countries, multinational countries that are using suppliers from our region are already putting these requirements for at least low carbon supply produced elements, or if not, it's going to go to net carbon as well. I have two additional inputs I would like to make about the fossil fuel subsidy. I know that we've seen Indonesia a couple of years ago experimenting with it, and what was the big outcry from the public because the government has not done enough preparation. So that's why I mentioned Singapore case, where when they put the cost, the water price higher, they went from one community to the other. They used students from the university to go to one family to another family to explain to them what the implications of the rising of the cost of the water will be. Then there was a vote, kind of like a referendum. Similar thing should be done when a country would like to do carbon pricing, when they want to do fossil fuel subsidy reform as well, supporting that. And it's there was a study by ISD when we were promoting green growth, and it's included in the green growth roadmap that ESCAP has published in 2012. That shows that basically fossil fuel subsidy does not support the lower strata of the society. It actually supports the top 48% of the society. So basically, it is better to collect that revenue from the top 48%, equalize the game for them, change their mindset, because they continue to buy the fossil fuel-based cars, for example, which are very expensive, and they additionally subsidized, and electric vehicles are still having difficulty to penetrate, and use this revenue to provide clean cooking stove, clean heating energy for the lower strata. It is possible, and that's why I'm highlighting again the enabling factors that now this stage countries understood that they need to work across the ministries together to support the NDC targets, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do the sectoral implementation. Each sector has to take the burden for the reduction. So that's very important. And the third point I would like to make, the carbon neutral pledges are very dangerous. If you calculate it, it's there for 2050. 2050 is where I would not be alive. None of us that is here in this meeting will be alive. So it's very easy to make that pledge. There's not accountability. Who will know if that's implemented or not? And so we need to think about diverting from NDC pledges doing a full inventory of the emissions per sector and defining the commitments of every sector, and then down to the enterprise level, to the private sector level, their commitments, their accountability, and creating a system that they report how they implemented that, how they reduce their emissions. That is now the game ball until 2030. If we don't do this, we are not serious about reducing our emissions.
Thank you. Just saying, I do hope I will be alive in 2050. Jens, I see your hand up.
I also hope to still be around, but of course we don't know. Anita, maybe you're right. Just a 2000 or mid-century or 2050 or 60 net zero commitment as a standalone announcement and commitment is kind of relatively worthless. But I think giving such a commitment and setting this signal, then obviously also it has to be translated into short and midterm measures. And I think giving the signal, yeah, of course, there's an accountability issue. You can't set the signal for 2050 and then not do anything until 2045. So obviously, other countries, also your own population will look at you and say, what are we doing? How do we get there? So I don't think that these commitments are useless. I think they're actually good and they put pressure. And they put the signal for the economy. So obviously, knowing that my government has committed to such goals, yeah, will influence my planning for investments. And obviously, it has to be taken serious. And as I said, short and midterm measures have to be introduced. I maybe also want to come back to one aspect which I hadn't mentioned, and the aspect of revenues and the use of revenues. So obviously, at first, these carbon prices instruments will introduce a new revenue or will introduce more costs. But I think the essential goal is that we want to reduce emissions. So if the economy, and I think there is of course a pressure on production costs, if they come down with the emissions as soon as possible to reduce cost, I think everyone would be happy. We'd be more than happy not to have too much additional revenues from these instruments, but actually we want to steer economy away from costs. So it's not purely about the revenues. Also shouldn't maybe focus too much on it. It's really instruments. It's like we need to urgently come down with the emissions, and I'd rather have effective emission reduction by 2030. And it's easy for me to say, maybe not for governments always, but I'd rather have half of the emissions and less revenue to be really on track than to have a huge income from these instruments.
Okay, but I do want to go back to one question that Lynn had posed in the chat here, and that is, why does the carbon price remain at these very low levels after a few years of experimenting with it? Who would like to share thoughts?
I can add here, that's because of that fear of impacting inflation or productivity or competitiveness of the production sector. And at the same time, the production sector is heavily subsidized. Some of them are 3 times subsidized. Fossil fuel industry is 3 times subsidized. Why? Because extraction of fossil fuel is subsidized activity. Then distribution is a subsidized activity. Then the whole company gets additional price reduction on using fossil fuel for their production. So this is really such a lost and waste of funds. that really keep our population in poverty. And that has been studied very well during the green growth era of 5-6 years ago. So it's time to revisit this. Now with the circular economy, a lot of that discussion is coming up again, to look where the hidden costs are from being too much high carbon. And so from being too cautious, it's the highest price of carbon in the region at the moment is in Singapore, $3.69. Even the Japanese one is only $3 US dollars, so it's very low. I'm not very sure what is the Chinese carbon price because they just launched the ETS system, but that is a different thing. That's not creating revenue. So yes, it is very low.
Ayman, maybe from your perspective, why do you think that the level of carbon price remained so low?
I think Anita is right. And our ministry is not regulated our price of carbon in Kazakhstan. It is from demand and the proposal of operator of installations in the frame of our trade system.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Jens, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether that's,
yeah.
I wasn't sure whether that's a specific question for Kazakhstan or whether that's a question like why do we have such low carbon prices globally? Basically, they could be much higher, and they also, if you look at the modeling, as Anita was talking about, but also other examples, the carbon price should obviously be much higher to set the signal that we need. But I think in general, of course, there's always the opportunity for the regulator to some certain extent. Of course, if you have a carbon tax, you just set the price. If you implement a carbon market, an ETS and a carbon market, you're more interested in caps. So basically, you would say, this is my cap that I want to reach. And everything above the cap will get very expensive. So it's an instrument where you can either decide you want a fixed price or you want a fixed emission reduction. And then, of course, if the industry reacts and can reduce the emission, the prices will be much lower, and that's what we all hope for.
Great, thank you. I'll go back to two questions that had been raised in the chat earlier. Maybe one directed to Ayman because it focuses on Kazakhstan, on how Kazakhstan can work together with other countries in the region to support and share experiences learned from the implementation and development of the ETS. And the other question, more general for Asian Pacific, goes to Jens and Anita. So Ayman, over to you. How can Kazakhstan work together with other countries in the region to support and share experiences?
We plan the work, collaboration work with another Central Asia regions, and now we just receive the help from developed countries like UNDP and GIZ organization in development of our strategic documents for low carbon development of Kazakhstan, and we do not share our experience with another countries, unfortunately.
But could it be useful going forward? I think that other countries have a lot to learn from your experience that you had shared with us earlier. So maybe we can hand over to Anita first and then Jens on how countries can better collaborate and work?
Yeah, basically what we support very much Jens and the whole UN FCCC team that is promoting Siaka and the carbon dialogues. We've done the work for Central Asia together, and the roadmap that was developed there is very good, and we are making all our efforts to mobilize the wider UN support, because we need the UNDP country teams and their funds to help support this roadmap for working together on promoting, developing better carbon pricing instruments in Central Asia. And then the example from Kazakhstan will come forward as one of the most advanced one. Uzbekistan recently also is planning something, and we know Georgia has embedded that as well into their NDC that they submitted recently, and they also want to invest certain of the revenue to nature-based solutions for carbon sinks. And so this is a good opportunity to collaborate. In the ASEAN sub-region, we're working also with Jens' team and with UNEP team to assess the opportunity for carbon markets. And I think ASEAN is moving a bit faster because there's much more interest in developing that. So definitely sub-regional approach is a very good opportunity. And actually this will help the region to prepare for a higher carbon price coming from Europe with the goods, because the carbon price is now already 50 euro per ton in Europe. So that is going to impact trade relations and goods, costs of goods that are imported from Europe, and production of these goods as well.
Thanks, Anita. And before I hand over to Jens, I would just like to remind everybody that we're getting to the end of the session. So if you have any other questions that you would like to raise to the panelists, please put them into the chat now.
Thanks.
And Jens, over to you.
Thank you. Not so much to add to what Anita just mentioned. So we're working very closely in both regions with ESCAP and other UN agencies, and I think that's a very strong collaboration there. Also under these new form issue-based coalitions, because, for example, Anita was sharing some very useful information about the modeling that ESCAP is doing. And then, for example, UN Environment also looking at different aspects, and we have maybe historically not so long, but for the last years, a very good relationship there with the AWGCC. So I think at this point, where there is such a large interest from many agencies and development partners in this topic, to really bring us all together, to really everyone brings to the table different elements, such as the modeling, which of course we wouldn't be able to provide, and countries really get the impression they get a support, a coordinated support from different agencies under different aspects. We've also done some groundwork. I'd say that the work on MRV systems and harmonizations and some of the studies we've done in the region now really start to pay off. And then with the growing interest of countries to actually engage, and also with some of the experience that's been gathered, for example, from Singapore, but also here in Thailand with the voluntary systems, and Vietnam and others. So this all now slowly comes together, and also the countries that maybe in a couple of years back were not so interested to talk about the cooperation in these aspects really can benefit from these early experiences. And yeah, again, in Central Asia, we've also focused on this region. We are a little bit more advanced in ASEAN in the discussion, but I think the interest is there. And if we continue to bring countries together and exchange the experience, and together then work on under the roadmap, and there's some good basis to advance the work on carbon pricing now.
Thank you. Thank you, Jens. I don't see any further question in the chat. So I would probably just like to get a quick temperature check from all three of you. The overall session focus was on the role of carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform to contribute to a green recovery. And we haven't actually spoken too much about green recovery in this session. So how optimistic are you that countries in the region will actually support or follow a green recovery that makes use of the instruments that we discussed? Very quickly, just 1 minute, each of you.
Temperature rise is like
Anita.
actually a dangerous topic, right? Should be in the 1.5 degree assessment. I would say that after the COVID, and especially if most of the countries manage to reach UK, where they will see a lot of this convergent green post-COVID policies that are supporting NDC and net zero pledge of UK, then they will get more ideas and will be much more courageous to come and do the additional review of NDCs. So overall optimistic, but after COP.
Let's wait for COP first. Ayman, how about you?
Could you repeat the questions?
How optimistic are you that countries such as Kazakhstan, in your case, will actually use carbon pricing instruments and fossil fuel subsidy to support a greener recovery after COVID?
I think that our roadmap that we develop now, this roadmap would realized in all our sectors, and we could be carbon neutral republic in 2060. Thank you.
So very optimistic. Great. And Jens,
Yeah.
last word to you.
Yeah, maybe I should have gone first to end with an optimistic view. I'm not very optimistic. I think I expressed my optimism before that these instruments will work and that there is some real mobilization and some real momentum on climate happening. On the other hand, I think we heard it yesterday also in at least one of the sessions that really the greenness of the post-COVID recovery measures is a bit disappointing so far. So I think it was really a relatively small percentage in line with the green economy, a small percentage of these post-COVID measures and economy incentives. So there I'm not very optimistic. I would have hoped that there is a more green that the recovery packages are greener than they seem to be at the moment. Obviously, still we're still in the pandemic, and the recovery will take much longer. So I hope that the momentum of the climate and green and circular economy and the momentum of the recovery will kind of merge somehow, and we'll get a more greener recovery. But I'm also optimistic that we have gone beyond a point of no return in the climate discussion. So I think it will all come together at some point. It just takes a bit longer than we thought.
So more balanced picture. Okay, with this, I would like to close this session. Very, very big thank you to our three panelists, Jens Radzinski, Anita Nikolova, and Ayman Esekina, and also to all of our participants and the questions that you had raised in the chat. And with this, I would like to hand back over to the organizers. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Katinka. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Katinka, for the excellent moderation.
So let me also thank Jens, Anita, and Matt again for your excellent presentations, and also thank Katinka for moderating the sections. I just wanted to announce that the next and also the last section will start in 30 minutes at 2 p.m. Bangkok time. And again, the meeting link will remain open. And thanks also all participants for joining us today. And we hope to see you again at the next sections. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.